My husband's ex-girlfriend disappeared without a trace 3 years ago, but when she suddenly turned up, he started spending all his free time with her, forgetting about me. I was washing dishes when my husband's phone buzzed on the counter. He was in the living room, oblivious, laughing at some comedy special on TV. I glanced at the screen, and for a second, my mind didn't register what I was seeing. Hey, it's me. I don't know if you'll even see this, but I'm back. It was from her, the ex-girlfriend. The one who had disappeared 3 years ago without a trace. No social media, no calls, no sightings, just gone. And now she was back, just like that, slipping into his messages like she had never left. I should have ignored it. Pretended I never saw it. But my heart was already pounding, and before I could stop myself, I called out to him, "Hey, your phone went off." I don't know what I expected, confusion, hesitation, maybe even panic. Instead, he grabbed his phone, read the message, and his entire body stiffened. He didn't even look at me before he typed something back. "Where are you?" He barely spoke for the rest of the night. Every time I glanced over, he was glued to his phone, tapping out messages, his face tense with concentration. I tried not to pry, I really did. But after 3 years of nothing, how was I supposed to just sit there while my husband lost himself in a conversation with a woman who had vanished without a trace? Finally, I broke the silence. "So, are you gonna tell me what's going on?" He looked up like he had forgotten I was even there. "It's Emily," he said, as if that explained everything. I crossed my arms. "Yeah, I figured that much." He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "She just showed up out of nowhere. She says she's been through a lot, but she doesn't want to talk about it over text." My stomach twisted. "So, what? You're gonna meet up with her?" "I mean, yeah," he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "She's been missing for 3 years. I need to see her, make sure she's okay." Something about the way he said it, "I need to see her," made my throat tighten. "Do you though?" I asked. "I mean, I get that this is weird, but she's your ex. You don't owe her anything." He frowned. "That's not fair. She was my best friend before we ever dated." There it was. The thing he always said to justify keeping in touch with her back then. Before she disappeared. Before we got married. Before all of this, she needs someone right now, he added, standing up. "I have to go." And just like that, he was out the door. I sat there, staring at the empty space where he had been, and I had a sinking feeling that this wasn't just a one-time thing. Emily was back, and my husband was already slipping away that night. He came home late. I was already in bed, but I wasn't asleep. I heard the front door click shut, the quiet rustling of his jacket as he took it off. I kept my eyes closed, my breathing steady, pretending to be asleep. But when he slid into bed beside me, I could feel the shift. His body was there, but his mind was somewhere else. The next few days were more of the same. He started coming home later and later. When he was home, he was distracted, his phone practically glued to his hand. Every time it buzzed, my stomach clenched. I didn't want to be that wife, the insecure, paranoid one. But how could I not be? "She's been through a lot," he told me one night over dinner, finally offering up more than vague explanations. "She won't say where she's been, just that she had to leave for her own safety." I raised an eyebrow. "For her safety?" He nodded, stirring his food absent-mindedly. "She said she couldn't reach out before. That she didn't have a choice. But now she's back, and she doesn't have anyone else." I scoffed. "Right. So, naturally, you're the one she comes running to." He shot me a look. "Come on, don't be like that." "Like what?" I snapped. Annoyed that my husband is spending all his free time with his ex-girlfriend? "She's not just my ex, she's my friend," he said, his voice tight. "And she needs me." There it was again. "She needs me to—" I shoved my chair back, my appetite gone. "Well, I need you too. But I guess that doesn't matter, does it?" I didn't wait for his response. I walked out of the room, but I already knew. This was only the beginning. Emily was back, and my husband was slipping further and further away. Days turned into weeks, and my husband was with Emily more than he was with me. He stopped making excuses for it. At first, he'd tell me things like, "She just needs someone to talk to," or "I owe her at least this much after everything she's been through." But eventually, he stopped explaining it all. I'd wake up alone more often than not. He'd leave early, claiming she needed help with errands, paperwork, or just some company. And when he was home, he wasn't really home. He'd sit on the couch, texting her, a small smile tugging at his lips, one I hadn't seen in months. And the worst part? She was everywhere now. It started small. A mention here and there. Then it escalated. "Emily wants to check out that new bar downtown. We should go." Emily told me about this crazy thing that happened to her today. "Emily's been really into hiking lately. Maybe we should try it sometime." We We. Like she was part of us now. I tried to keep my cool. I really did. But then he did the one thing I wasn't prepared for. He invited her to his birthday party. We had planned a small get-together. Just some close friends, dinner, maybe drinks. Something intimate. Something that was supposed to be about us. But the moment he told me, I knew. It was about her. She doesn't have anyone else, he said. Like that made it okay. I don't want her to be alone. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. So what am I then? Just the woman who shares a house with you while you spend all your time with her. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's not like that. Then what is it like? I demanded. Because from where I'm standing, it sure as hell looks like you'd rather be with her than with me. He stared at me, lips pressed into a tight line. For the first time in weeks, I saw hesitation in his eyes. Like he was trying to decide if he should lie to me, or if I already knew the truth. But before he could answer, his phone buzzed. He looked down, smiled, and just like that, I had my answer. So, the night of my husband's birthday party finally came, and I just knew, it was going to be a disaster. It didn't even feel like a party for him anymore. It felt like a welcome home celebration for her. Emily showed up late, of course. The kind of late that makes people notice you when you walk in. And my husband? The second she stepped through the door, it was like his body had a radar locked on her. He went straight to her without a glance in my direction, like it was some rom-com moment where the long-lost lovers reunite. And the hug? Way too long. The way she melted into him, the way his hands lingered on her back, it was like the rest of us weren't even there. The whole night, they were in their own little world. Whispering, laughing, standing a little too close. Meanwhile, I was stuck playing hostess at what was supposed to be our party, but I might as well have been invisible. At one point, I was in the kitchen pouring another drink when Sarah, one of our friends, leaned in close and asked if we were all just supposed to pretend we weren't seeing what was happening. I laughed, but it was forced, and I tried to brush it off. They were just catching up, I said. But she just gave me this look, like I was the only idiot in the room who didn't want to see the truth. She pointed out how my husband had barely spoken to me all night, how he looked at Emily like she was the one he was married to, not me. And I hated that she was right. I stood there, gripping my drink, watching them from across the room. Emily leaned in, her hand brushing against his arm as she whispered something to him, and he smiled, really smiled, in a way I hadn't seen in months. That was it. I was done pretending. I walked straight up to him and told him we needed to talk. He looked confused, like I had just interrupted something important, but I didn't care. I pulled him into the hallway, my hands shaking with frustration. I asked him if he even saw what he was doing, if he realized that he had spent his entire birthday acting like I wasn't even there. He looked at me like I was overreacting, like I was making a big deal out of nothing, and then he said it, the one line he had been repeating for weeks now. She doesn't have anyone else. That was his excuse. Every single time. Emily needed him. Emily had been through a lot. Emily had no one. But what about me? Didn't I need him too? Wasn't I supposed to be the person he put first? I asked him that, my voice barely above a whisper, because I was afraid if I spoke any louder, I would break. And he just stared at me. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He didn't say anything, and that silence? That hesitation? That was my answer. Then, just as I was standing there, barely holding it together, his phone buzzed. And I watched as he actually checked it. Right there, in the middle of our conversation. His face softened. He smiled. And I knew that whatever connection we used to have, whatever love I thought was still there, was already gone. I wasn't his wife anymore. I was just the obstacle standing in the way of whatever this thing was between him and Emily, and I wasn't going to stand in the way any longer. I didn't walk away that night. I couldn't. I told him I was tired of pretending everything was fine. I told him I was tired of coming second to a woman who had disappeared from his life for 3 years and suddenly returned like nothing had happened. I asked him if he even realized how much he had changed, how much he had pushed me aside while making Emily his priority. He sighed, rubbing his face like I was exhausting him. He told me I was reading too much into things, that I was making something out of nothing. And then, he said it, his favorite excuse, the one he had been using for weeks. Suffice it to say that Emily has been through a lot. I stared at him, waiting for more, because I was done accepting that vague explanation. I told him I wanted specifics. What exactly has she been through? What was so serious that it required my husband to spend all his free time with her? He shook his head. He said he couldn't tell me because it wasn't his story to share. That Emily had trusted him with things she wasn't ready to talk about yet. That if I really cared about him, I would trust him to handle it. I almost laughed. I asked him if he even heard himself. She trusted him? What about me? Was I not supposed to be the person he trusted? Was I not the one he was supposed to confide in? He sighed again, like I just didn't get it. He told me it wasn't about trust, that it wasn't about me at all. He said he was just trying to be a decent person, trying to do the right thing, and it wasn't fair for me to turn this into an issue about our marriage. That was when I snapped. I told him he could pretend all he wanted, but I knew what I was seeing. I told him if Emily was just a friend, then setting boundaries with her shouldn't be a problem. If she was really just someone who needed support, why did she need him specifically? Why did she take up all of his time? Why did he look at her the way he used to look at me? He gave a short laugh under his breath, shaking his head. He said I was being paranoid, that I was acting insecure, that I was trying to control him. I stared at him, and for the first time in weeks, I felt cleared. I asked him, if I wasn't standing in front of him right now, would he even be thinking about me? His jaw tightened. He didn't answer. That was it. That was all I needed to hear. I turned to leave, but he wasn't done. He asked me what I expected him to do, ignore someone who had no one else? He said I was being unfair, that I was making him choose between being a good person and being a husband. I told him I wasn't making him choose anything. I told him he already had. I walked out of the room before he could say anything else. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just walked away, because there was nothing left to say. I was done, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to my husband move around the house. I heard the sink running, the low hum of the fridge opening and closing, the soft creak of the floorboards. I wondered if he was thinking about what I had said, if my words had hit him the way his silence had hit me, but he never came to be ED'd. In the morning, I found him on the couch. His phone was in his hand, screen dimmed, like he had fallen asleep mid-text. I didn't even need to check to know who he had been talking to. He woke up when I walked past him. He sat up slowly, rubbing his face, looking at me like he was waiting for me to say something. I didn't. I went about my morning as usual. I made coffee. I got dressed. I picked up my bag. And then, as I was heading for the door, I finally spoke. I told him that things couldn't keep going like this. That I wasn't going to sit around and wait for my marriage to fall apart piece by piece. He let out a tired sigh, like he had been preparing for this conversation all night. He said he didn't want to fight. That he just needed time to figure things out. That Emily still needed him right now, but he promised things weren't what I thought they were. I asked him what, exactly, I was supposed to think. I asked him how I was supposed to believe him when his actions told me everything I needed to know. He ran a hand through his hair and said he didn't have all the answers yet. That was when I knew we were past the point of fixing this. I told him I wasn't going to live in a marriage where I was waiting for my husband to decide if he still wanted to be my husband. I told him I wasn't going to keep playing second to a woman who had already left his life once and could do it again whenever she felt like it. He looked at me like he wanted to say something, like maybe. He was finally realizing what he was about to lose, but then his phone buzzed, and right there, in the middle of our conversation, in the middle of me telling him I was done, he glanced at it. He didn't answer it. But he looked, and that was all I needed to see. I picked up my keys, opened the door, and walked out. This time, I didn't look back.